All right, I think we should be good. So Seth, take it away whenever you are ready. If you don't mind doing like a brief bio too, for people who didn't read the website.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, just again, thank you for having me here. My name is Seth. I've been a software engineer for 3 years now. I came from a background where I actually did construction and some building engineering, some manufacturing work for a while. I did CAD, and so I kind of transitioned into software. I started a boot camp in 2019. I graduated in 2021 in March and got a job a couple months later. So it's been, I guess about almost 3 years now, but it's definitely been a long journey, and so I'm excited to like talk more about kind of my journey and like what I found to have helped and what I didn't find to have helped. And so yeah, I'm actually currently in Colorado. Grew up in Washington, but moved out to Colorado last summer. And I'm married and I have two dogs, so my spare time is spent a lot of on my dogs. So
I love it. That's so cute. How are you liking Colorado?
it's good. It's good. Coming from Washington, I just turned 30, and so I lived in Washington for 29 years, and it's a big change because there's a lot more sun and it's a lot drier. But it's nice to move somewhere else, see new scenery. But I really like it. I wish we would have moved here sooner, and I'd encourage more people to move out here. It's really nice.
Oh, very cool. I don't know why in my head, Colorado and Washington, like, do you mean Washington State?
Washington State, yeah.
Okay, in my head, Colorado and Washington State are like right next to each other. Are they not?
They're pretty close, and a lot of people compare them because they're very similar. A lot of outdoor activities, a lot of a lot of people do like hiking, and there's a
Okay,
lot of
yeah, that's what my
mountains and
mind
stuff.
was
Very
at. You're like,
similar,
it's a
yeah.
very big move. I'm
It's-
like,
yeah.
is it? Okay.
Yeah, they're very similar. I think the big difference is Washington's very rainy and humid, and it's very dry here in Colorado. It's almost like a desert. It's more
Okay.
similar like Arizona, really hot in the summers, lots of snow in the winter, but it's really dry. So a nice difference, I think.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming, and we're happy to have you.
Oh, of course, yeah, and thank you. Yeah, and so I think I guess I'll just start off kind of the main talking points I had that I wanted to go over, and I'll try to keep it, time segmented. But basically, I just wanted to talk about like imposter syndrome because I know that's something that everyone probably has read about and seen in multiple different facets. But I just kind of wanted to talk about like my experience with it and like how I think I approach it now and how I look at it, and why I think it's really important, and then job hunting, just how to channel your time and effort into making sure that you're making an impact and that you're feeling like you're moving forward and not getting stuck. And then keeping motivated is another one I want to talk about. Being interested while you're working, but also like not getting hung up and getting burnt out, right? That we all commonly talk about here. And then finally, just like I think how to grow and succeed is one thing that I've recently been struggling with, and so that's something that I think is I really want to talk about as being important to in that early on journey because I think you can really set yourself up for success if you do it early on, right? Learn from your mistakes. So, um, but yeah, so I'll just start about like imposter syndrome. I mean, I know a lot of you probably heard of it. A lot of people probably talk about it in the industry. Um, I I think it's a good thing to be aware of. I think it's important because I think the first part of like imposter syndrome is really acknowledging that like everybody's different, right? Like everybody comes from their own background. They're facing something different, right? And so like when I went through a boot camp, and I know that a lot of you have probably different backgrounds where you came from when you're getting into software. I went through a boot camp, and so it was very like non-traditional compared to the college route. I was with a lot of people in my classes that were really smart. They had done programming in the past. Maybe they've been working as a developer for a couple of years. And then I also have people like myself where I had never written any HTML or CSS until I really got into the program, right? And so for it was really nice to see the dynamic, but it's also intimidating, right? Because you come into it and you're like going through these courses and you're like, I'm really struggling to like quote unquote, like center a div or something, right? That's kind of the joke a lot of software engineers have is like, I can't center this div or I can't, change the background color. What's going on? And then you have this person in your same group who's like, oh, this is easy. I've done this a million times, right? And it's really easy early on to like, I think, get in that mentality of like, maybe this isn't for me, if everyone can do this. But I think the biggest thing with that point is like just remembering that like everybody comes from a different background, right? And not everybody's always on the same page when you go into software, right? I mean, some people learn really fast, some people take longer to learn. It's totally normal to have this wide variety of learning curves in software. And so I think just, going on to the next point about like we kind of all learn at our own pace. I think just keeping that in mind is really important as you grow in the industry and as you're going on and learning more and more, right? There's going to be things that you're going to struggle with. There's going to be things that you're going to breeze through. And there's going to be things that you're going to learn, and 2 months later, you're going to come back and you're going to say, I can't believe I forgot this. I got to look this up on Stack Overflow. I shouldn't be looking up how to do this, but it's totally normal, right? And I'll kind of get into that later about like growing and succeeding. But like, big thing with imposter syndrome was like, even senior engineers spend can spend weeks at a time to solve a bug that was one line of code, right? I mean, it's everybody's been there. Everybody's spent a long time to do something really simple. Everyone's spent, a lot of time learning something that maybe was easy for other people. And I think that just remembering that it's different for everybody and that everyone learns at their same pace. And I think the important thing with like imposter syndrome and like keeping motivated with it is like obviously try not to let it get to you, but just remembering consciously that like everyone's on their own path, right? And so even if you have to work a little harder at it, it's still worth it. And even though it is frustrating, I think, the last part of that is like surrounding yourself with people that might be in a similar boat to you. That's what I did going through boot camp. I kind of latched onto a couple people that were similar to me. I actually have one of my best friends that came from boot camp. He used to be a chef. He was a chef for like 20 years, and he is like, I want to get into software. And so he was really, really good at one thing that I knew nothing about. But I think he channeled that, experience that he had before into software, right? And he kind of picked and choose like what his strengths were. And I think working with somebody that has that similar mentality as you do is really important to kind of keep you going, because when you are struggling, sometimes there are people that are like, well, okay, this is really easy for me. I'll try to explain it. But I think having somebody explain things that where they're kind of on the same level as you at that point that you're at in your career, right? Or your learning path is really important, because it makes a lot more sense and it's a lot less, I won't say demeaning, but it feels more comfortable, right? You don't feel as bad asking people questions when you're talking with somebody that really has an open mind understanding that. So I think like as far as imposter syndrome goes, it's really important just to like keep that in mind and understand that like you're not alone in this, right? And I think finding somebody that's on a similar path to you is really important. And that's what really helped me when I was going through, a lot of times when I wanted to quit, it was like, okay, I could lean on this person and they had a similar mentality that I did. And so it really helped a lot. Um, so I think that, takeaways from that are just being like, try to find some people that you really vibe with, and find some people that are in a similar situation where you're coming from. And that really helped me get through that imposter syndrome and like realizing that, no, it's okay. Like everybody deserves this, right? It's not like nobody, specific people do or don't deserve it. It's everybody deserves this. If you want it bad enough, you can get it. You just have to find people that align with how you're doing, right? I think that's really important. So, and then going on to the next point with that is going through that, after imposter syndrome, obviously going through schooling. And once you're done with schooling, you're like, okay, well, now I got to find a job. And that's like, I think arguably, depending on everyone's opinion, everyone's has a little bit different opinion on this. But I think my opinion was like the job hunt was probably one of the toughest parts, because there's a lot of competition from other people that like maybe do have, more experience than you or less experience than you, right? But there were some things that I really found helped me land jobs. So I've worked on 15 production applications, and that's from like web apps to local applications to I've done a couple mobile applications. So I mean, I've worked on a lot of different variety of applications in software. And I think the one I've worked for 3 different companies, and for 2 of those companies, I was contracting. So I worked on multiple applications for between 2 and 6 months at a time while I was there for, say a year or two. And so I think one of the things that I found that really helped me during job hunting, was obviously like LinkedIn, but I think more specifically, like finding people that are willing to mentor you is really important. Um, and I guess, hence kind of like why this is such a great program, what Callie has going on, is because I think having people that you meet up with regularly is crucial to getting a job. And I say that because it kind of helps you stay on track, right? And it kind of gives you ideas to bounce off of each other. But also, I think the biggest part about, say, like, having a mentor, like going on LinkedIn and like searching for people that are maybe offering mentorship, or even reaching out to people individually at like companies that you like and saying, hey, like, I really noticed, like, specifically developers, I had really good luck with this at like a lot of companies. Like, I had a couple connections at like Divi, I had a couple of connections at Yahoo really early on that, like, even though I didn't end up getting a job at those places, they were able to offer really good advice, and they would like look over applications that I was working on, or do mock interviews, right? And actually, there's another speaker, Lindsay, that actually turned me on to, and introduced me to Callie. That she was one of my first mentors early on. Like basically, yeah, right, like basically as soon as I graduated, right before I even got a job, I was just posting a lot on LinkedIn, trying to drive traffic and like speaking up, engaging in the conversations on LinkedIn. And she reached out to me because she noticed, like, hey, this person seems like, they're really interested in getting in the industry. They're posting on LinkedIn a lot. And people notice that, especially developers, I think. And it's really important because, like, for example, Lindsay, awesome person, like super great mentor. She's a senior engineer. So she basically helped me do a lot of like mock interviews. She like read over my code and she was like, okay, let's go through and explain this like we were in a technical interview, right? So I had a lot of experience before I even got interviews going into that, which was super helpful. But the other thing is that she is a senior engineer. At the time, I want to say she had 4 years of experience or 5 years of experience. She knew other people and other positions and she knew I was looking, right? And so one of my jobs I actually got specifically because she gave me a recommendation for this position. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think like job hunting, the hardest part is getting in front of somebody to interview, right? But if you can get somebody who knows somebody who can give you a recommendation, it's almost always an instant interview. And a lot of times, I think that is the most important part because this particular job that I got, the second job I had, I was actually auto filtered out of the position on LinkedIn. So I would have never even got an interview at the company that I got hired at. But because I was like, reaching out, networking with people, Lindsay was able to introduce me to the owner and be like, hey, I think this person's a really good fit. And I ended up getting the job, even though I got auto filtered out on LinkedIn. And so I think that's one thing about job hunting that I'll say is like, not necessarily going on LinkedIn and posting all the time, but just like reaching out to companies that you really like, making connections with, especially developers. Engineering managers, I think, is also good, but they're really busy. And so, like, reaching out to developers and companies, building these relationships, even if down the road, say a year down the road, they have a position, right? They'll be more than happy to recommend you because they've worked with you, right? It's better than some random person who has a resume that they're applying and they're going to talk to. So I think that's one thing about the job hunt that really helped me. Um, and the other thing with that is, I'm sure you've probably all been told this at one point, but don't follow the requirements on job postings too hard. So early on, I made mistakes and I was applying only for like, say junior developer positions with 0 to 2 years of experience. I mean, I was really religious about not, submitting any applications for anything that said you needed 2 years of experience. But a lot of times what I found the more that I applied and the more that I got interviews with companies is that most of the time, even if I didn't have an actual job before I actually had my first job, they were willing to take my schooling as like some experience, right? So even though I did a boot camp, it was a year and a half part time, and then I spent about 3 months after that. So I had almost 2 years of coding experience, even though it wasn't professional experience. I could tell them, okay, well, I've been hands on coding for almost 2 years, and a lot of companies were okay with that. And so I missed out on a lot of probably early interviews potentially just because I was like selling myself short. And I think that, with that being said, that fourth point on like job hunting that I wanted to talk about is like tailoring your resume and being like personable on your resume is really important. And I think like, yeah, and great point there. Like, don't market yourself as a junior engineer. Just market yourself as like a software engineer with experience. And, I think the biggest thing too with that is, you know, trying to emphasize like the hands-on coding experience is really important, I think, right? Because a lot of people, and obviously there's all different backgrounds, whether you came from college or like a four-year university or a boot camp or you're self-taught, right? Maybe you didn't go to school at all and you've been coding for 3 years. Anything that's hands-on that you can show them and prove to them, like, hey, look, this is what I've actually been doing. That's more important than anything, right? And it's more important than anything they see on a resume or a certification or anything. I think the most important thing, like in my experience where I got interviews and I got jobs, was like I was able to just show people and talk to people about what I was working on and how passionate I was and how much I liked it. And I've been in interviews on the interview side where we were interviewing people and they had a ton of experience, but they weren't passionate about anything that they were working on, right? We would have them bring in a project and they would say, oh yeah, I've kind of been working on this, it's okay, but they just didn't seem into it. And I think remembering that, like, even if it's something small, even if it's like a function you wrote that, I don't know, converts something on a web page to something else, or maybe you have this like, really complicated form that you built. Don't undersell that. I mean, forms, for example, are some of the most complicated things in software, in my opinion. And so if you can build out this super complex form, like, and show somebody that, people are really impressed by stuff like that. I mean, even if it's like some really cool CSS or animations or something, like, don't sell anything you have short. And I think that, like, when you're on the job hunt, especially just having things that you really want to focus on and talk about, especially with mentors or people that you meet in other companies, is really important. Like, just having something that you're really passionate about, the employers love seeing that, and they love seeing passionate engineers that like love what they do. um, and I think so, going into like the fourth point, which is like I want to talk about like keeping motivated. That's a really hard part, right? I mean, I'm sure everyone's always heard the stories about, I submitted 500 applications and I got 10 interviews and I got one job offer, for my first job or something. And my story wasn't quite like that. I want to say I probably put out 200 applications, but again, like, I think staying motivated, like, I would say, like, don't be afraid to fail, but like also experiment, right? And I think part of that motivation is, what really helped me is like experimenting a little bit. So I kind of took this approach of, I'm going to try something for a week. And if it's not working, I'm going to try switching it up after a week, right? Because sometimes it might be like maybe the way your resume is structured, you just don't get noticed, or maybe the way that you're reaching out to people, or if you're doing cold outreach, with people, maybe they just don't like the approach that you're taking. Maybe you're being too aggressive, maybe you're not being aggressive enough. It really depends, right? And so I think with staying motivated during your job hunt and just staying motivated in general, like, just don't be afraid to like fail and switch things up, right? I've switched my resume probably 20 times in the last 2 years. I mean, I'm always constantly changing it. I'm always tweaking how I'm wording things. I'm always like, you know, uh, modifying like my description for like my coding boot camp, for example. Sometimes they don't want to see coding boot camp. So I'll put like, okay, this is like a certification that I did, and I did this many hours in hands-on programming. And sometimes that's better than saying like I went to a boot camp and I have a certification, right? It just really depends. And so I think, not being afraid to fail, but also being willing to experiment and kind of playing around with like how you're applying, how you're answering questions, how your resume is structured is really important. Like, there's not a magic recipe that solves all of the problems, but I think there's definitely certain ways that you can play around with it and modify it so that, maybe you find one way works and maybe you find one way doesn't. Maybe you get a lot of bites with one way. And if you do, like, stick to that way and keep tailoring that. And that really helped for me. When I find one that really worked, while I was starting to get replies back, I dove into that and I started like really hammering down on that. But if you're also not getting any feedback, I think, it's important to not get too hooked on it and being willing to say, okay, you know what, it's been a couple weeks, maybe it's been a month, I haven't heard anything, I haven't, even gotten any feedback. Let me just try something else. And oftentimes, more than not, that's when you end up getting something, from my experience. So I think that's really important. Um, Also, I would say, with that, like, keeping motivated, I know one thing that I really ran into, and what I hear about other software engineers running into, is like, so for example, sometimes, like, say you've been working on one thing for a long time and maybe you're getting a little bored, or you want to branch out, or you see a job where, for example, maybe they're doing, mobile development, or they're doing like React Native or something. Like, don't be afraid to go out and just kind of learn about it, right? So I've my first two jobs I did contracting, so I was building. I've worked with React, I've worked with Vue, I've worked with Angular, Next.js, which is like server side React framework, and then I've also just recently, this current company, I've worked with Gatsby. And so, I mean, I've worked with a ton of frameworks like JavaScript, TypeScript. I've worked with NoSQL, SQL databases. I've done React Native. I've done, testing. And I mean, it's intimidating, because when I was applying for a couple of these companies, they're like, okay, we're going to be doing this and this and this and this. I'm sitting here thinking like, I don't know how to do any of that, right? And I think sometimes the best way to stay motivated is just to like be open to trying those new things, right? And I think for me, even though it was tough in the beginning, what really helped me stay motivated with like being in software in general was learning about those things, and, just not being afraid to like jump in and be a little scared, right? Because I there were a lot of times when I so it's one um this one program that I wrote for a small client. It was only like a 2-week contract. I had learned a little bit of Python like way back in boot camp, but I'd never used it. And they wanted to do an automation to update and like scrape PDFs. And then it was for like the IRS or something. And they wanted to scrape PDFs. They wanted to send this data, build an Excel sheet, and then upload it to Dropbox, all in like an automated script. And they wanted it to be like in the cloud. So they wanted to run this like cloud function. All of a sudden, I was like, I've never done any of this. I was like freaking out because I'm like, okay, I have 2 weeks to get this thing done. Like we're on billable hours, like, and I,
Hey Seth, we can't hear you anymore. Did something change on your side in terms of setup? We lost you at billable hours.
okay, how about now?
Yep, you're good now. Sorry.
No, sorry about that. Yeah, I saw something pop up at auto switched. I have like a little dock. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think just, like not rambling too much on that, but um just being willing to like, I think, experiment with new libraries, types of development is really important because in a way, even though it's tough, I think it keeps you learning, right? And in software, that's really important because you have to always stay curious. And then you never know, one day maybe you'll hop on a contract and they'll need somebody that needs that experience, and you're going to be really glad that you like, spend some time to learn even a little bit about that. I found more often than not, even if I learn a little bit more about something rather than just like getting it done later on, I was able to go back and say, oh, you know what, I've actually done a little bit of that. Like now I can take that and apply it to another project or something, or another interview, right? um, and I think so, like rolling into the last one, I know that I'm gonna say there's like 6 minutes left. So like the basically like how to grow and succeed, I think is really important too, because I've been recently kind of struggling with this and thinking about this. And I know all of you are at like different journeys, right? A lot of junior engineers. So like I think the most important thing that I realized when I was a junior engineer, and even now, because I'm like technically a mid-level, but I've only been in for 3 years. So I still have so many things to learn, right? But I think the most important thing is like having a goal and like a vision of where you want to go, because sometimes it's really easy to say get into a job and you're like, okay, I just want to make it, I'm just trying to survive here, I'm drinking from the fire hose, I'm trying to like get caught up to speed. But I think at the end of the day, like still having a goal and a vision of like where you ultimately want to be is really important, because throughout your journey, even early on, you're going to be able to make decisions for yourself that really determine like the outcome of your career, even 3-4 years down the road, right? Whether maybe you get into something, you're like, I really like doing back end, I think I want to work for like a back end company, maybe I want to go work for like 1Password. They're a total back end software development company, and I've one of my buddies works there and he loves it, right? He was really back end centric, but he was on a front end team, and he spoke up and was like, hey, listen, like I think I want to learn more about the back end, I really like the back end. And so like that really helped him grow and succeed into his area that he wanted to be in, and then ultimately led to him getting a job that he really liked, just because he was willing to say like, okay, what do I want for myself, right? And that's really important, is like thinking about yourself, not always worrying about like what the company wants, but worrying about, you know where you want to be, and say where you want to see yourself in a year or 2 years, or 5 years, right? What's your ultimate goal? And like what do you enjoy, and how are you going to make your future decisions and what you're currently doing to get to those goals, and like follow that goal, right? um and I kind of talked on it before, but I think like challenging yourself to learn new things is really important. So like for me right now, my current job is a lot less stressful than all my other jobs. This is probably one of the easier jobs I've had in software, but I find myself sometimes getting bored with it because there's not a lot going on, right? And I think now is when I'm starting to ask these questions like, am I going to get stuck in this role? Am I going to be able to like, keep moving up? Like if I want to eventually be a senior engineer, am I going to get stuck in this role? Am I going to forget about like, doing all these complicated backend scripts or these Python like PDF scrapers? Like, am I going to forget that if I stay in this role for too long? And that's when you kind of start to like the black clouds come in. You're like, okay, maybe I don't know like how I'm going to succeed or grow with this. But I mean, it's just another important thing to remember, like, um, with that, like, just making sure that you're still on the right path, right? And even though maybe you're doing something that you don't like, finding a way to turn it into something else that you could learn. Or like maybe if you do have a job where like, you'll have some jobs where you're really busy all the time. You'll have some jobs where you're a little bit slower. Maybe taking some of that time to learn more about something else is really important. And that saved me a lot as far as like growing and succeeding, is just being willing to like go out and like follow that. Yeah, time to make a coding Callie workshop. I like that. I'd be down. I don't know. I feel like I mean, I'm just really happy to like be here and talk to everybody, because I feel like I'm at that point right now where I'm not a junior engineer anymore, but I still have a lot to learn, and so I really like to be able to like talk about my experience and like hopefully help answer some questions about what everybody's going through, like, um, and like I think also too, just like building a network of people that like inspire you is really important. And so like, I'm hoping that like I can, you know, maybe inspire all of you, or maybe even thinking about, oh yeah, I'm kind of like feeling stuck in this rut, or like how do I get out of this rut, or like I'm not getting any responses on any of my applications or anything, like what do I do? And I think just like being willing to take a look at it and approach it and talk with people that have been through that's really important, because like there's not one way that works for everybody, but I think taking different approaches can help, right? And I think in this industry the biggest thing is like I don't want any of you to like give up on it, okay? Because I know it can be really tough. And that's one thing where like, my buddy right now, he's that guy I went to school with. He's going through a company where he is at a really like low point. He's been trying to get out of this company. He's underpaid, but he's in software, right? And sometimes in your career, inevitably, you're going to get to that point where you're going to say, like, oh my gosh, maybe I just should quit or something. And I think, if I could say anything, it would be that just like stick with it if you truly like it, right? A bad manager, a bad employer can make or break your like vision of this industry. And I think it's really important to just remember that like if you don't like where you're at, you always have an opportunity to go and change that and like maybe try something else in this industry, right? There's so many different things you can do. I think it's also really important to just remember like, keep an open mind. And it's tough when you're a younger engineer because there aren't as many options to say, oh, I'm just going to go out and apply to like the senior position where I'm in high demand. Like maybe a junior engineer isn't as in demand as a senior engineer, but there's always still a place for you. And there's always a way to get into something else. Like maybe you're having trouble, you could look into QA positions, or maybe you could look into like, like a UX developer position where you're like more design centric. There's always a way to get into it, but I would say like, this industry is really great and there's a lot of really awesome people. I think this is probably the only industry I've ever worked in where I actually was like well, not, I won't say not the smartest person in the room, but everybody here is so smart in the industry that like you could always learn from everybody, and everybody is so nice and kind and willing to help that like I don't think I've ever had another job in an industry where people are like this. And so I would like encourage all of you to just like, don't give up, keep at it. And like I think the most important thing is just like if you really do love this and you want to be here, like it'll happen. It might take longer for some, but it will eventually happen and it will be totally worth it. So hopefully that has provided some with my rambles provided some
Thank
insight.
you so much, Seth.
Only a minute over.
No, you're so good. Okay, so we'll open up for questions now. So if anyone has a question, why don't we just do like the raise hand emoji? And then Seth, you can just call on people as they have them. And I always have a million questions. So if no one raises their hands, then I shall just start asking because I'm very intrigued by your career. All right, but floor will be you guys' first. Go ahead.
All right. Who we got? Oh yeah, Isaac. You got some. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you get me? Are you able to get my question?
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah, you're
cool.
good.
All right, cool. I read some questions out. So I heard you talked about a contract. The first two roles you had were contract based, right? So my main question is how did you like get those contracts?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and actually that's a good question and thank you for asking that. I should expand on that a little more. So, um I've done a little bit of contracting. So my first job, I was hired as a contractor, but I actually worked on contracts within the company. So technically, I guess it was like a 1099 or a W-9 employee. That particular job I got specifically because of the boot camp that I went to. There was like a board. So I'll say that like my first job I got really lucky because my boot camp had a board of people, and um I had never worked in software before, but when I worked in project management for like construction and manufacturing, I worked on a lot of different small jobs, and I like worked on contracts and managed contracts. And so I actually had previous like experience with kind of how the contracting world works, but it just wasn't in software. And so that's how I really got that job. I think was like they were looking for somebody that understood the contracting world. My second job, I was an in-house like full-time employee, but my company sourced contracts. So I was lucky where I didn't actually have to go out and like find any contracts. Which and sorry, I should have made that distinction early. So basically the first two companies that I worked for, I didn't have to like source any of the contracts. My company just like went out and they bid for contracts and did like small software jobs. Currently, I'm working with or on a contract for a small company, a small recruitment company where I'm building them like a marketing website. That contract I actually got through a mentor that I have. She knew somebody that was looking for somebody to build a website, and we just kind of started talking. And I just was curious about like asking what they wanted, and we just came to like an agreement. And that was like my first kind of jump into contracting. So I wish I could offer more advice into like how to get into contracting, but I've known a few people that were in contracting. What I will say is that contracting can be very lucrative, but it can also be really difficult. And I think the most important thing with contracting is knowing like what the end goal is. And if you're looking to get into contracting, I would be really careful with making sure that your client is like a reputable company or somebody that you personally know, because sometimes you can get burned by contracting. I would say that if you really want to go into the contracting world, I would really focus on that. But for a first job, it might be kind of tough just because there's a lot of unknowns when you go into it, right? My contracting experience, I will say, you learn a lot really fast. And so if you can get a job at a company where they do software contracts, I would highly recommend that, because you get access to a lot of different tech real quick. Like I learned I had worked on 10 applications in the first 2 years of me being in software, and not a lot of people that have been in software for 2 years can say that. And it was tough, but I learned so much about so many other things that I think I was actually really happy that I was able to work in contracting um, early on. So hopefully that answers your question. Oh yeah, Gabe, you got something?
Yes, so you mentioned before to don't always pay attention to the years of experience when applying to a job. Would you just say always don't pay attention to how many years of experience, even if it's like 12, or is there like a limit that we should be looking at?
No, great question, and yeah, that's a great thing to clarify. I think it's somewhat relative. I mean, it depends, but I would say, oh gosh, what's a good rule of thumb? That's a really good question. For me, what I do is I usually will apply to something with either my current amount of experience that I have, or like potentially up to 3 years more. So like for right now, because I have 3 years of experience, technically like a lot of people at this point in their career will go out and they'll apply for like senior positions that require 5 or 6 years of experience. So this current job I actually got required 5 years of experience in React, which I didn't quite have 5 years of experience with React, but I started React early on, so I had about 4 years. But basically when I went into it, I explained like, I've been using React for 4 years. I don't have 5 years of experience, but I have four, and I've been using it basically since I started my boot camp, and they were okay with that. I think a lot of times, and I don't know if maybe this is like what Callie's seen as well, but I think that a lot of companies, they they post for their perfect candidate, right? They want somebody who's the IT department, who's a front end developer, who's a UX developer, right? They want to get the whole basket in one person, right? But most of the time they're willing to settle for not having everything. And so I think that's the important thing to remember is like if you're applying for something that say has 3 years of experience and it's your first job, I would still apply for it because even though they put 3, they're probably willing to go down, and hire somebody that doesn't have as much experience. Kind of similar, like say if anyone's familiar with like selling things on like, Craigslist or Facebook or something, right? Like if you want $50, you might post it for 70, but like you're probably willing to take 40, right? I think that's how I've seen a lot of companies with their applications. Like from my experience is like I would say don't be afraid to go like 2 or 3 years above what you're looking for. If you're feeling really lucky, you could do more, but I think most of the time you might just get auto filtered out based on your resume, which is kind of the tough part of that.
Just to hop on and add, I gave advice once to a friend who was going to apply to a job. And I told him, like, be super confident and like, don't worry as much about the experience. And that's true. But just there's a line, and I'm sure Seth, this is not what you were saying at all, but I just want to clarify because I've given advice and then it went a wrong way. There's a line between like being confident and like saying, I have other ways of experience. I have like different ways that I like the school that I went to, like I thought in this way, and this is a transferable skill. There's a way of explaining that. And then there's lying. So like, don't cross the line because like, I can tell when I'm doing an interview if someone is just like flat out lying. Like I've had someone try to sell to me that their boot camp project was a startup company and like they like worked on it for all of these months. I was easily able to go look up that it was a boot camp final project and they worked on it for like 2 weeks. You know what I mean? So yeah, you have transferable skills. They're often like says they don't want all of the years, but yeah, just don't push it to like I have 10 years of experience and I can do this job, So fine line.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Like even if you have say 2 years of React, but there's someone that says they want 3, and you're like, I could probably just put that I have 3 years of experience with React. Like, not a good idea. However, like, yeah, I would totally agree. Like, don't lie about it, but also like just be honest with them. And I think a lot of employers usually, if you're just like, hey, listen, I don't have 4. If they give you an interview, they're interested, right? So even if they're requiring or they're wanting more, just being honest about it and saying like, listen, I only have 2 years of experience, but I mean, I've been using it, on and off all day for the last 2 years religiously, right? And I think that goes to show too with like, even if say you worked a job where maybe you worked there for a year and you didn't use a certain technology for that entire year. That's another thing sometimes where I've been in interviews and they said, well, okay, but when was the last time you actually used this? And I'll say, well, I haven't used it in 6 months, or, I haven't used it in a year and a half, and just be honest about it. But say, I have used it before. Like I've had a lot of interviews like that where someone says like, hey, have you used TypeScript? And I'm like, at the time I hadn't used it in like 8 months. And I said, well, I haven't used it in 8 months, but I know how to use it. Like I've worked with TypeScript. I haven't used it in a little while. And usually they're okay with that. They just want, like Callie mentioned, like just the honesty, right? So just, yeah, always be honest about that. All right, who else? I think I saw, was it Catrice? Did you have your hand up there for a second?
I did, but I think Gerardo had his up first.
Okay, whichever one of you wants, whoever. I don't know who was first.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Hi Seth. So I'm interested in learning about your interviewing experience. How did you prep for it? And do you have any tips?
Oh yeah, great question. So when I would say the biggest thing that I did for interview prep was mostly just being very familiar with talking about different things that I worked on, different projects that I worked on. I know it's subjective sometimes because all interviews are different. So for an example, like my first interview, I didn't have a coding challenge at all. It was just talking with the CEO of the company about what I knew. And after that, I didn't have to like follow up with anything. I didn't have to show them any code. I think they just had to know that I was confident about talking about certain things like, React and like what is React and like how does JavaScript work and like, what other kind of styling libraries or how can you use CSS to style different things or, like what is what's a serverless function or something, like a lot of questions about just seeing how I could do on the fly. And so I think the biggest advice I would give was just be very familiar and be able to talk about certain technologies in a way that you understand it, right? I think there's a way to kind of explain what a technology is or like how you might be able to use it. But I've had a lot of interviews where people ask about, if you were in this situation, what would you do? Like one of my interview questions that I was not prepared for, but it really got me thinking about interview questions in general was they asked me about caching, and they said, say you run this function and it's takes 5 seconds, but you need to make it 3 seconds. Like what would you do? And I'm like, I don't know. This is the first interview I've ever taken. Like I probably rewrite it and maybe like try to size the data down a little bit. I'm not sure. But I was honest with them and I was like, I'm not really 100% positive, but I might try this and this. And they were like, okay, well, let's just say you need it to be faster. And I'm like, oh gosh, and it's like, it's really, those are the questions they give you. And it's really easy to get, caught up in the moment and get a little freaked out or worried. But I think because I was able to just talk about other things that I might try, even if I wasn't sure if they were going to work, I was like, well, what you could do is you can maybe like figure out where you're sourcing your data and like maybe structure it differently. You can go back and like try to figure out if there's a different way to structure the data. Maybe we want to use like local storage to store some of that so you don't have to like pull it in all the time from the API maybe. And ultimately, I didn't even really give them the answer that they were looking for, which was utilize caching, right? But because I was able to talk through it and I knew enough about like programming in general just to talk my way through what I was thinking, that was, I think, on all the interviews I've ever taken, that was the biggest thing that all of the employers really hammered down on, was like me being able to just talk through with them about a problem and give my opinion on like how I might solve it. They weren't always necessarily looking for a right or wrong answer, but I think just being able to talk about something is extremely, extremely important, right? I mean, even if it's just something as simple as, I had an interview one time where somebody asked, what's your favorite JavaScript library or like your NPM package? What's your favorite? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I've used so many of them, but like it's a weird question, right? But I was able to be like, okay, well, if I had to pick one, like I think I would pick like, I forget what I said at the time. I think it's like Formic or something. I had been using Formic a lot. And I was like, Formic is so nice for like, form validations and all this stuff. And even though I didn't really have a reason for it, like I was able to talk about like how I've used Formic and like why I liked it compared to something else. I think that's really important too. I wouldn't get too caught up on say like coding challenges or like knowing every answer to every question about like, how would you do this to a JavaScript string, or it's like, some complicated thing. I would really focus on just like, I think being personable and being able to like talk through and explain how you think about something is, at least to me, that's been the most invaluable thing I've come across in interviews so far. Oh yeah, and then Catrice, go ahead.
I was wondering how you worked through imposter syndrome and does it ever go away?
Great question. I wouldn't say it ever really goes away permanently. It just kind of comes and goes at specific times. That's been my experience. So I know that, even let's say, so like, I guess, for example, like how I've dealt with it, a big piece of how I've dealt with it is, ironically enough, it's like looking back at like where I came from even like 2 or 3 months ago, right? Or even like 6 months ago, is a way that I really beat anytime that I have to deal with imposter syndrome. Like, because the thing about imposter syndrome is like, I don't think that feeling's ever going to go away because no software engineer knows everything, right? We're always solving new problems every day. And that's part of why our jobs are so great, but why they're also very tough, is because you might one day be solving this problem that's super easy. You're like, oh, I got to build this new feature. I got to like, maybe render like some profile pictures of a team and like put their data in here. And then you'll come up to this challenge and you're like, I've never seen this before. I have no idea what I'm doing. And I think it's really easy in the moment to get caught up in that and say like, I'm not cut out for this. Like someone could probably figure this out. Even this week I had something where I was working with that, and I just, you kind of get into that slump of like, oh, I was doing so good for the last 2 weeks. Now all of a sudden this week, I haven't done anything. I've been, beating my head against the wall trying to figure this out. But I think the most important thing is like looking back and realizing like, this doesn't happen all the time. I don't think it ever goes away, but there are times when it comes and goes. And I think for me, the biggest thing that's helped me deal with it and battle with it is thinking back to even say a couple weeks before that when I'm like, oh, remember when I did this great feature and the team was like super happy that I did this, or like maybe I'll think back to like, maybe there was like a year ago when like I did this Google API integration and my boss was like, that's like the fastest I've ever seen somebody do that, right? And for me at the time it was awesome because I was like, I felt so good about it. And I'm like, and this is like I only had like a year experience at the time. But then the next week maybe something was really tough, right? And so I think the biggest thing with imposter syndrome is like realizing that like, everybody at one point is stuck, right? And even senior engineers, like I said before, like senior engineers will still spend weeks at a time on a bug. I think I've heard a story about somebody who spent like a month fighting this bug, and somebody was like, why did it take you a month to do that? And it's like, that's just the nature of the job. There's not always a direct answer for something. You don't always know what the answer is. A lot of times you're searching for the answer. And so I think just understanding that it's totally normal is a big part of, being comfortable with it and being okay with it, but also just remembering that, don't beat yourself up too hard if you can't figure something out, right? It's everybody goes through it no matter how much experience you have. I think that's really the most important part about getting over it when you go through those tough times, bouts of imposter syndrome. That helps.
And always remember that the last time you felt imposter syndrome and you had a bug, you made it through, right? Like you're still here, you're still coding, you figured out your bug. So like you're gonna figure out the next one, like we're not doing rocket science here. Like, like someone else has done what you're trying to do, likely, you'll find some obscure Stack Overflow article. So, you'll reach out to a mentor and someone will have seen this before. So yeah, so you'll get through it. You'll find the bug and then you'll feel really proud of yourself. And then you'll have a new bug and you'll feel like an imposter all over again. And it's just the fun cycle we live in.
Totally agreed. And real quick, like I think you made a great point, Callie, about like not being afraid to ask for help if you're stuck for too long. I don't think I've ever met an engineer that's been upset about me asking for help, even if I spent 2 days on something and he was like, why don't you just come to me after like, a couple hours? I would have been totally fine. And I was like, you feel dumb, but it's like, just remember that everyone has been in your shoes and everyone understands. So like, yeah, that's great advice too. It's just like, don't be afraid to ask for help if you're stuck, because I don't think I've ever met an engineer that hasn't wanted to help with something like that.
Yeah. Also, people love to flex. You know what I mean? So like
that too.
right? Like how often have you struggled with a bug and then you figure it out and you like, I want to tell people how to do this. You know what I mean? Like I want to be like, this is how you do the first step and like, how cool is this? So like all of the senior engineers you work with, even like the other junior engineers that have just worked on the code base for a few more weeks than you, are excited to share what they know. So yeah. And if you do feel like you're bugging people, you just find a bunch of mentors and spread your questions out, or
Yes,
you
agreed.
ping one of your friends and say, hey, can you go ask this person this question and then let me know what they say, because I've already asked too many questions today.
Love that. Let's see. Oh, Ethan, looks like you got something.
Yeah, I think my main one was for the resume. I know since the resume is like the first thing employers see, that's where you kind of get auto-filled out or you get accepted. So I was wondering if you have any recommendations on how to phrase achievements in our resume, or if there's certain templates you've learned that are better for the tech industry, if there's anything that we could do on the resume portion that would help us with interviews.
Great question. So as far as the resume structure, what I've grabbed as really good tools that I've kind of kept with me in like my resume tool pouch over the years that I've I've found have been really helpful, and I've talked with like a lot of other like senior engineers and like even hiring managers and whatnot. What they really like to see is there's a couple of things. One, I would say sorry, I think it just switched again. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, cool. I would say, yeah, don't make the resume too complicated. With that being said, I think when you're defining, like, say, strengths or things that you've worked on, a really good rule of thumb that I like to follow is I like being descriptive, and I like to structure my sentences or like my bullet points in a way that gives, I would say, like quantitative or qualitative results on like what happened after I did something. And so an example of that might be, um, like for example, recently I was working on our Gatsby build was taking a really long time. It was timing out after like 20 minutes on when we were. Sorry, I don't know why I keep switching. And I would say a good way to put that on a resume would be to, instead of saying like, you know, I worked on a Gatsby deployment and maybe I was able to like work with the build. I would say, okay, I like you did A, and that result of you doing A resulted in B. And that example might be like, I was able to cache some of this data on build, which resulted in a 20-minute down to 3-minute build time or something like that, right? And so I would, and it's not easy to do on everything, but I would say when you're putting points into a resume, if you can make it qualitative or quantitative, because employers like to see um like, I would say, how do I describe it, they like to see things that you've done that have positively affected the app, not like I built a, you know, profile card or something like that. But instead of saying like maybe you built a footer, right, a way to describe it would be to be like, um maybe you uh, built a footer, or you like architected and designed a footer for the website that allowed customers to more easily see the information for the, or, you know, the clients could more easily see the information about the website. I don't really have any sources that I use for doing like a resume template per se. However, I will say that if anybody's interested in like what my resume looks like, I'm more than happy to like share that somewhere. I've had a bunch of different iterations. I probably changed it at least 20 or 30 times over the last 3 years. But I feel like the one I have now is had I've had pretty good luck with it. And I would say like the keys of that are like listing out your skills very directly at the top is, I think, priority number one in my experience, because employers want to know what you know, what skills do they have, what frameworks do they use, right, as a software engineer. And then I would put your work experience and, you know, bullet point out your work experience with qualitative data for things that you've done that have made an improvement in the application. And then I think those two things have really had the biggest effect on me, like either getting interviews with people or people, you know, being willing to say, oh, I noticed on your interview, like you mentioned about this, can you talk more about that? That was a huge thing in interviews where they were able to really look at those bullet points and say, oh, how did you like, you know, speed this build up, you know, or how'd you cut the time in half on this build, like what did you do? And that spurs conversation and interest.
Yeah, I my resume is kind of a problem because I don't have a lot of years of experience, and I jumped to the role that I'm at, which is exciting, but also difficult because you look at my resume and you're like, how is she a senior software engineer for her first software engineering job? So I stack that with my personal projects, and something like coding with Callie is the way to add to my resume, right? So like I code every single day on the Coding with Callie website / planning, the project planning tool. Both of those will be on my resume as like full stack applications. I'm going to deploy them. I have links for, you know, you can go see. I have all my videos on LinkedIn. So if you look me up, you can clearly see I know how to code and these are the things. So try to like view it holistically. It's not just your resume, but like it's your whole online presence that you're like curating. So anytime someone Googles you or looks you up, you know, they can see the whole picture.
Yeah, that's great advice too. I would say like the projects are another big part of it. If you don't have a lot of work experience, I would say replace any work experience with projects. And I don't know what your opinion is on this, Callie. I've never actually thought about this, but um, I know early on I was tempted to put like other experience that wasn't software related on my resume because in a way, you know, until you get to a certain point, you might have other jobs, right? I personally I kind of tailored it and took things from my other jobs and tailored it more toward a software perspective. Like, for example, I was in project management and I worked also in a warehouse and I like ran a warehouse before I was in software. And so I was able to pull points that weren't tech that not necessarily were tech related, but related to like say working on a team or like, you know, managing something or like some kind of inventory system. Like even if it's not something directly related to software, the concept behind it can also be really big if you don't have a lot of work experience or if you're looking for your first job and, you know, say you have projects but you also want to put some real life work experience. I personally would say definitely put that on there. Just make sure you relate those points to software and that can come in handy too. That for my first job really helped a lot.
Yeah, I am a big fan of a cover letter, which I know is not a popular opinion, but I've career switched multiple times now and I've had to sell myself as soon as I switch into the new career. And like the cover letter is where I do it. I walk through my resume, but I walk through it from the perspective of like, I was a woodworker for 5 years, right? But like, when you see the resume and you're like, she sold tables online, how does she build software, right? Like then I would in my cover letter explain like, you know, if you can build a table, you can build a website and like talk about all of the ways that it's a transferable skill. And so I would say the cover letter for like not a lot of experience is the way I've gotten my foot in the door to like 2 job switches. And then also, I don't know, I just don't think cold applying is like the way to like I wouldn't in my job search, if I were going to start job searching, I wouldn't just start cold applying because like my resume is short. I feel like I would go the route of like networking and talking to people, building in public and stuff like that. Because if you don't have a lot of experience, especially in this market, I just like I just don't think your resume is going to do so much for you when there's hundreds of resumes. But like one view on your resume, think of how many views your like a video of your project is going to get online instead, you know?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think that's where I had most of my luck with I guess almost all the jobs I've gotten has been really just from word of mouth or people that I knew that were able to like either recommend me or at least get my resume in front of somebody to look at, right? And that's a super that's also kind of it's almost kind of like a hack because you know, like you said, sometimes you get filtered out of job applications. Like even being able to just like talk to a developer at the company that's interested and be like, hey, I saw this, you guys had this position, like would you be able to like, you know, talk to me about it? And you most of the time, I think every time I've mentioned somebody about that, they've been like, oh yeah, sure, let me just, you know, send me your resume and I'll like give it to my boss or the lead engineer or something. Like almost every time that's happened. And so like that automatically puts you ahead of the process of having to wait for people to filter you out, right? If that's going to happen, there's a way that they can get in direct. And I would say that's huge. It's just
The
knowing
only
people.
success I've had with applying is applying to a very local company, and it's because I live in Michigan, which is not a hub for developers. So I'm pretty sure I was like one of 3 people who applied to this position. And even then, when they interviewed me, they're like, we don't think you have enough experience for this job. And I had to lie, which I already said don't lie, but I had to be like, oh, I'm totally building a project in PHP. Let me show it to you next week. You know what I mean? And then I had to hurry and build a project in PHP. So like, I don't know, like if I were job hunting, the fixing up my resume and sending in 1,000 applications would not be my strategy. And I would say, let the data drive those decisions. So like if you've sent in 500 resumes and you haven't gotten an interview, like you need to switch your game plan up because the resume is not working.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. Did you have something, Isaac?
Yeah, I think I have a question. So, let's say I've connected with someone on LinkedIn, and my end goal is for me to reach out to them, trying to ask them if they can be my mentor. How how do I keep up the conversation to actually leading for me to ask that? Do I ask them directly, like, can you be my mentor and stuff like that? Or it has to be like, how is it supposed to be actually?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it might be partially subjective to depending on who the person is, but like I think the biggest thing I would say, at least when I've reached out, because there was a point early on before I had my first job where I was doing that. I was cold outreaching to like developers at these companies I really wanted to work at. And the thing I kept in mind is like they get a lot of messages probably all the time, right? Especially if there's no position, I'm sure they have a ton of people messaging them. But I think what's important is like when you reach out to somebody, depending on how you phrase it, I think it's really important. So like I've had people reach out to me about companies I worked at for positions, and the ones that I really noticed were people that weren't immediately like, "Hey, I was just wondering if you could give my resume to your boss or something," which I mean might sound a little obvious, but I think there were other people, and this is what I try to do is when I reach out, just have just a small conversation about something in general, like maybe it's for example like this company Divvy that I really wanted to work at. They're I want to say Utah. They're like a finance software company. They have a ton of really great engineers. So I reached out and I looked at their engineers and I figured, okay, let's just see if I can find somebody that I might be interested in talking with. I looked at their posts and I found something that they were posting about that they seem really passionate about, and I just basically messaged them, was like, hey, I saw your post about this. Like, this is really interesting to me. Like, yeah, could we talk a little bit more about this? Or like, what do you think about this? Right. And then you kind of drive a conversation like more organically. And then after you talk for a while, I think you'd be really surprised at how many people, if you were like, hey, I was just wondering, like, I'd be interested in Divi maybe down the road or something. Like, do you have any advice or something? I would say most of the time, everyone that I've talked to that, or even anyone that you would potentially talk to, would be more than happy to like give you information or help be a mentor. But that's, I think, mainly because like you're showing interest. You're not just going out directly asking them about it, but you're also just you're generally showing an interest in like either something that they're talking about, so they're relatable to it. Um, and then after that, you can talk more about it. That's how I got a couple of my mentors, is really just like being interested in kind of what they were talking about, or maybe that interested me. So I would say that my advice would be, if you're really looking for just a mentor in general, I would say try to find a company that you're really interested in. Go on LinkedIn. I would try to find somebody that you seem like you might connect with, and then just like message them about something that they're posting about. I would say that's probably like my biggest piece of advice. I mean, that's what's worked for me in the past. So
Definitely. I get very turned off by a big ask, or like an ask where like you're gonna make me do the majority of the work, like the lift in this relationship. So I love the idea, Seth, of like reaching out and like about something that you learned about them or something that they're interested in. And like Isaac, I would do a small ask first and then maybe a big ask later if you guys get to know each other and it seems like you are kind of getting along. But like I had someone the other day be like, hi, I'd like to apply to your company. What jobs should I apply to? So like that would require me to go look at what jobs are available at my company, go ask you for your resume, compare jobs to your resume, and like no, I don't have time to do that. Now, if they would have found a specific job and said like, hey, I don't know if you have anything to do with this team, but like, what is this job? Like, like, do you, or like, what are you working on? Or like something like that, like, but do the legwork for them and then kind of take the conversation from there. Cause like, obviously I'm always happy to chat about coding with people, but like, I can't take an hour out of my day to like type LinkedIn messages back to people. But anyway, we are over time. Seth, this was so great. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us and answering our questions. I feel like I learned a lot and hopefully everybody else did too. And yeah, maybe you can come back and do some resume reviews.
oh, definitely, that'd be great. No, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for listening to me ramble. Hopefully, I was able to help shed some light on some things you had questions on, and just give you some incentive to like stay with it, and like it's a really great industry wherever you're at, right? And I think it's really important to just like enjoy what you do, and like I'm glad all of you are getting into this industry, or if you're in it already, like it's awesome. So I know all of you will be successful landing those jobs that you really want.
And you can connect with Seth on LinkedIn. His LinkedIn is linked all over my LinkedIn now, but then also on the website for the guest speakers. So go ahead and follow him, and maybe Seth is a potential mentor for you.
Yes, totally. And yeah, feel free to reach out, message me. Like I'm totally happy to help anybody with anything. Like I'd be more than happy to talk. And like, you know, even if you have questions about anything, and like as this goes on too, I think I'll be really excited to like, you know, join in with the team and like do some mentoring or like, you know, getting on those conversations. Like totally happy to help. You know, if I want to, you know, take the experience I have and like give it to others where I can help. So I think, you know, it's like paying it forward, you know.
For sure. All right, guys, I will let everybody go to bed or do whatever young people these days do. And I will see you next week. Our next speaker is a front-end dev named Michael, and he's going to talk about accessibility on the front end, which is be a little bit more technical, but I think it'll be really cool too. So hopefully I see everybody next week. And Seth, you're more than welcome to join any Coding with Callie meetup if you want to. All right. Bye, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.